In this video, we're talking about the exposure triangle, the three main things that help us determine just what our image is going to look like, right? The three things that affect the level of light that's allowed into your camera and what results can that have, right? And what control can we have over these three different elements of exposure to also get different results, be creative, and achieve our intentions, our goals, right? So let's dive in here. First, exposure. It determines how light or dark an image is going to be. Sure. So we're thinking exposure overall is determining, well, how bright is our image going to be? And of course, we need to think about exposure based on what time of day it is, what our circumstances, our setting, right? What the environment is around us, and potentially what mood or what kind of emotion we're trying to get from our images. Now, exposure, again, is determined by three different things. The first one of those is a camera's ISO, the sensitivity level of the camera's sensor. We think about that now more specifically because of digital cameras, right? So ISO refers to the sensitivity of that camera sensor and how it's going to react to light. In the past, we would think about ISO in regards to the physical film itself, right? So we're thinking about the camera sensor now because we don't deal with physical film as much, unless you're doing that intentionally. But what we're thinking about really overall is ISO, and what we have thought about in the past is ISO as the sensitivity of the film. And you would hear about that in different levels, represented by numbers: 200, 400, 800, 1600, and it's always doubling as it gets more and more sensitive, right? Now, historically, when we were using physical film, certain film with a specific ISO was so sensitive light you couldn't even put it through like an X-ray machine, even though it was in its little film container, because it would react to that amount of X-ray light or whatever. The sensitivity level really does matter, and it's a good starting place based on what your environment is and what things look like where you're taking your image. An important thing to know is the more sensitive you make your camera, the more noise you're going to introduce into your images, right? The grainier they're going to appear. So if you're have a nice bright crystal clear day and you're taking photos or collecting images, your ISO doesn't need to be very high, right? But in a darker setting, you're going to, in the same location, you're going to need to bump up that ISO, but you can introduce some graininess and some noise. And here's just another example of sort of what it looks like. As you intensify or as you make your camera sensor or the film more sensitive to light, yes, it's still going to be able to take images in a darker or a with lower exposure, but we're going to introduce some of that graininess, some of that noise. Second element of exposure is aperture, the amount of light that is being allowed into your camera sensor, right? So it's actually it's like the actual iris, potentially your camera might call it. Aperture is that tiny little window that's allowing light to come through. Now, aperture is a really important aspect of exposure because it's directly related to depth of field. Okay, the shallow or deep depth of field that can be achieved and seen in images such as this, it's really affected overall by your aperture. So a lot of times when I'm shooting, I'm making decisions about what I want for depth of field, and I'm adjusting my aperture to achieve those results, and then I'm compensating with some of these other elements of exposure. The other element of exposure being the shutter speed. Exactly how long does that opening, that aperture, how long does it stay open for? Right? How long is it going to allow light to come through that small area? So the shutter speed can also affect a few things and give us some interesting results that we can use creatively or to, again, help reinforce a mood or emotion. So here's what it looks like with a very, very short exposure, right? So thinking of a still photograph, and we can capture these very intense, very fleeting, spontaneous moments, right? And things look a little unusual because we don't normally see them like this. And then you're thinking of long exposure shots that look something like this, right? Where you don't actually see the object even, you just see the trail of light behind it. Now, we're limited a little bit in shutter speed length when we're dealing with video, obviously because it's connected to video frame rate as well. We can't have exposure times that are longer than the frame rate, otherwise we won't be able to collect images in time, right? So we can't exactly do long exposure shots like this, but we certainly can use shutter speed and change that to get different results. A lot of times we use these really quick shutter speeds for action sequences where, in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there's the epic battle and there's things flying around everywhere. We get this sort of like intense, like we're right in there sort of feel by using that short shutter speed. And here's just a chart that kind of shows you, so you can put into perspective just how each element of that exposure triangle is sort of affecting all the other aspects, right? So it'll show you based on what your aperture size is, your f-stop, what the depth of field will look like, and how what shutter speed you might need to compensate for that stuff. And then again, bringing it all the way back to ISO, so you can start with the sensitivity level on your camera or film that you need to begin with. So that's the exposure triangle. We'll see you next time.